Let's build a spam filter and a reply agent, which is built on top of the LangGraph framework. So we just installed the package necessary for us to run the program. Next up, what we want to do is import the necessary modules. So before I get there, what am I trying to do? So we first want to read the incoming emails. Then we want to classify them as spam or legitimate. Number three, we want to draft a response for legitimate emails. And the fourth thing we want to do is to send information to Mr. Wayne when legitimate emails are received. The framework I'm using here in order to do this is obviously LangGraph. And here's a diagram on how this flow is going to work. It helps to think of LangGraph in terms of diagrams. So we first start out here, and then Alfred opens the letter. We want to classify that as spam, and we want to throw it away and get to the end of the graph. If it is ham, what we want to do is we want Alfred, that's the agent, to craft a draft of an answer and send it both. And then once that's done, what we want to do is validate, and we want to edit the message to send and eventually send it. It'll make more sense when we write the code as we refer to this diagram. So let's get started here. First, I'm just going to do an import OS, and then so here we're done with the necessary imports. Next up, what we want to do is we want to define various states. And what do I mean by states? You could think of states as information that Alfred needs to track during the email processing flow, right? And Alfred here is like the agent, right? The autonomous agent that we're talking about. So here's how we will do that. So we set up a state for the graph, right? And what we have here is an email with a category, a spam reason, whether it's spam or not, a draft of the email that we will send at the end of the graph, and messages. And one of the tips here is that you need to make your state comprehensive enough so that you track all the important information, but avoid the unnecessary details. So that comes with really practicing this thing. Now let's go ahead and define our nodes. So we take this state object, which is something that we pass in every single function when we're trying to do the graph. So it's kind of like when you come here, you want each and every node to have the access to the state. Um, Nodes in this case are these functions, right? And then the states are basically then we have a classified email and we have a state. And like here's where we want like whether it's a spam, and if it is a spam, explain why. If it is legitimate, then we want to categorize it as inquiry, complaint, thank you, and whatnot. Okay. Okay. And now we want to, so we did an import here, for the human message. Then we will actually, so this human message here is something we imported from the LangChain core messages. We are passing this prompt that we just created. I'm going to minimize that. The prompt that we created, and we're passing it here. And what we want is the model to invoke the messages, which is actually what we initialized here, this array. And remember, large language models actually take in a series of messages in order to reply or give an output. So that's how we will actually invoke that. You could read more about how LangChain does that on the LangChain documentation. After that, what we want to do is sort of get the large language model now replies, right? So this is where we are at. Like here, this is what we are doing here is we defining this part here. Like we're introducing the large language model so that it can classify it as ham or spam, right? So if okay, so if it's not a spam, we have this array of categories, and we want to go through each category here and check if any of these categories exist in our message from the large language model. And then we have a handle spam, where we pass in the states, and what we want to do is anything. So we do that, and then we have this graph response, same state. So we have this prompt here, which is Alfred is the butler. We want to draft a polite preliminary response to the email. That's the email, right? So we have the email, the subject, and the body, which we can get from the state graph because we have been passing those values around. And then we have a category here, and we can drop a brief professional response that Mr. Hug can review before personalizing. So yeah, just use the word hug here. So we want the large language models here to actually generate an email response. So this is the second part where we are generating an email response because we just classified that this was a legitimate email. So that's what we will do. What we do is we are returning a graph state. We're returning an output once this node has finished processing, and we return the email draft and the messages here, which is what we get from what we get from appending the message that we send the large language model to what we have set in the state. All right. So now we want to notify Mr. Hug, right? So it's here. And how do we do that? So we get the state from the graph. So I took this quick snippet I had. Basically, this is like printing like 11, like 50, like this equal to sign 50 times, right? And then we just print the sender information, the subject, category of the email that the state graph has kept track of, and the draft responses. And we finally print the draft over here, right? So this draft here, if you recall, was what we had returned in the draft underscore response. We need to define like a function for that. So if it's a spam, what we want is for it to call, for it to go to the is spam, right? So what is this is spam? Is spam is the node. Spam is basically like it's like the node that we will label that this thing should go to, right? And we'll come to that like a little bit later, right? As I'm writing the next functions, you'll see how this route email is being used to determine whether it should go to the drafts node or whether it should go to like the next node, right? Or go down this spam node, right? Handling spam node. Have here is we are adding a node and we are so so, okay, what are these things, right? So I'm just gonna explain it. Each of these nodes, right, which we have labeled as functions, which we have defined as functions here, right, have to be identified using a string key, and that's what we're doing here. So we initialize the graph, we add a node where this is the key, right? We're using the same wording to make it easy for us to identify the node. So this read email is this function we had defined, right? So now what's happening is we are defining this state graph. Okay, so we just define these nodes right here, right? And then what? So we start the edges, right? So we go email graph dot add edge start read email. So what does that mean? So we imported this start. That's the how LangGraph wants us to identify the start point of the graph, and end is where LangGraph wants us to identify the end point of the graph. So we start there, we read the email, then we classify it, and then then there's one node to handle the spam, or and then one to draft response, notify, and then so these nodes are just to add first. Then we need to connect them with edges, and this is where we're to connect conditional edges. So what does this mean, right? So from here on, right, we have two paths. We can't take both. The agent can decide to take one path, and that's where the conditional edges come up. So one path that it could take is the draft response path, and the other one is that it can handle spam, right? And how do we determine, right? And in order to determine this, we need to we can specify it like that. So we we so this is the start node, the classify email. Then we call the route email, right? Sorry about this cursor. So we have this route email, which we just defined here. And what route email does is it classifies it as spam or legitimate. And then we have this object, right? And in this object, we define spam. If it's a spam, so if classify email returns a spam, then we call handle spam. If classify email returns legitimate, then we call draft response. Then we go to draft response, right? So so that's how we define. So if the classify if from classify email, where do we want to go? We could go to handle spam or draft response. Handle spam or draft response. how do we determine that? We call the route email. So the route email is the one that define is the function that sits here, and it defines that this if we get a spam, then we go to handle spam. If we get legitimate, then we go to draft response. So that's how we add the conditional edges. From there, we add the final edge. And how do we do handle spam? So from handle spam, we go to end directly, which marks the end of the graph if it's a spam. The other thing we could do is the other thing we're doing is so this is a way for us to connect, right? So we connect drop response and we connect notify Mr. Hug right over here because there was no connection here. We don't want to leave the nodes hanging. And then there's one last one where we want this notify Mr. Hug to get to the end. And that's how we complete the graph. So once we have done that, we need to compile that. So we need to call the email graph.compile to finish the graph. Okay, so we can actually run this. And how would we do that? Is like we can let's compile an email like sender. So we invoke. So once we're done with this entire structure, we have to compile the graph, right, and bring this whole thing together. And we are running test cases on them. The first test case is to check if it's a legitimate email. We pass in email key, is spam, the spam reason, email category, email drop, and messages, right? So going back to the first node, right? If you see, right, our email state is this, right? So our inputs, right, could our inputs are the same, right, as what we have as the state. And that state is continually passed through all the nodes, and we access these values in those states to do various things in these nodes, right? So it's a number of ways to test this. We could actually try using LangFuse. We could use LangSmith, I believe. These are just systems for tracking how the graph states work. So we drew the diagram here, and we could walk through each of these nodes, but there are systems like LangFuse, LangSmith that help us see how this worked. I can actually skip all of that, and I'd like to like just print the graph. So great. So we could see that it's processing the legitimate email, and we are saying that, this is the email that we sent, and it's actually prepared a draft. Amazing. So we have this draft email that the legitimate email um, scenario worked out for, and then the spam email, which is the lottery one. And it's interesting. Let's see, have they actually? So they did not give a reason as to why this was a spam email. Sometimes because of not determinism, there might be a reasons, but I want to try and run it again. But so it's able to detect, and it moved it to spam. Um, Here, I think I ran it earlier, and I had a reason as well. Yeah, so it didn't detect a reason, but I think we can improve the prompt, troubleshoot a little more, we can figure it out. But The important thing here is that it was a spam email and it was moved to the spam folder. So this is an example of how the LangGraph agent works. I will try to do better videos in the future, but hopefully you learned something. Thanks.